In 843, the Vikings stormed the cathedral in Nantes, ruthlessly invading the sacred space and striking down anyone in their path. They slaughtered the congregation, sparing only those taken as prisoners to be hauled to their ships. According to legend, the bishop was delivering mass at the altar when he was killed. The Vikings caused a massacre, looted vast amounts of gold and silver, and demanded ransoms for the captives. This brutal image of Viking warriors is very familiar, though not all accounts are this detailed. But was this Viking violence truly exceptional, or just a reflection of the times? Let's find out. The eyewitness from Nantes suggests, albeit indirectly, that the Vikings were skilled opportunists. They attacked a month after the local Frankish army, led by Count Reynald of Nantes, had been defeated by the Bretons. Reynald, appointed by the Carolingian king to manage and defend the region, had held this position since 841, but he was killed in the battle. With the city left without military leadership and the army decimated, the Vikings seized the opportunity. The eyewitness hints that Lambert, the son of a former count of Nantes and labelled a treacherous villain by the writer, guided the Vikings through the treacherous Loire estuary sandbanks and islands. The truth is, the Vikings really didn't need the help of any Frankish noble to learn that the count was dead, the army defeated, and the city undefended. While some Scandinavians raided cities like Nantes, others were engaged in regular trade and interaction with the Frankish Empire and all across Europe. In fact, many raiders were also traders, capitalizing on opportunities as they arose. The Vikings were well aware of when and where to strike. They waited a month after Reynald's defeat, not just to assemble a large force, but also to time their attack for a significant Christian feast, St. John's Day, when people dressed in their best would gather at the main churches. This ensured a greater haul, both in treasure and in captives for ransom or sale as slaves. The attack was swift and unexpected. One moment everything was peaceful, the next armed Vikings swarmed the city. The citizens of Nantes were no strangers to conflict. Brittany, an independent duchy, was nearby, and border skirmishes were frequent. Moreover, the Frankish Empire had been ravaged by a bloody civil war for the previous 3 years, with the 3 surviving sons of Emperor Louis the Pious fighting over its division. But the Viking speed set them apart. While Carolingian and Breton armies moved slowly, giving civilians time to hide, the Vikings appeared suddenly from the sea on their fast ships, leaving little time for escape or defense. It is entirely understandable that those who survive a Viking raid would remember the attackers as ruthless killing machines, and the deaths of so many people would loom large in their memory. However, we should be cautious about concluding that the Vikings were primarily focused on killing. For most Viking raids, the historical records provide minimal detail, similar to the account by Prudentius of Nantes. Typically, the reports tell us only that the Vikings arrived, they ravaged, killed many, often including an important figure. Prudentius, for instance, notes for the year 836 that the Northmen again devastated Dorestad and Phrygia. Similarly, he states that in 844, the Northmen sailed up the Garonne as far as Toulouse, wreaking destruction everywhere without meeting any opposition. Both Irish and Anglo-Saxon chronicles briefly mention that they ravaged towns, burned monasteries to the ground, sometimes remain in the places they devastate. No reference to how many they were, and as for the area of origin, titles such as Danes are also quite vague. The vocabulary of the sources, lay waste or slaughter, wreak destruction, devastate, paints a vivid and brutal image. Yet the sources themselves are sparse and leave a lot to the imagination and provide little concrete detail to fully understand the extent and nature of Viking violence. Additionally, compared to the well-equipped Frankish armies, the Vikings were relatively poorly armed in the early stages of their raids. They lacked substantial protective armor, a situation that would evolve later in the Viking Age. Early on, they fought more as amateurs than as professional warriors. The medieval and modern portrayal of the Vikings is heavily influenced by the religious perspectives of those who documented their actions: monks, priests, and bishops, many of whom viewed the Vikings through a theological lens. We can see this in the response to the first known Viking raid on a monastery, when the theologian Alcuin questioned whether this was the beginning of the great suffering foretold in Christian eschatology or the result of moral failings of the inhabitants of Lindisfarne. Alcuin suggested the raid had both eschatological and moral significance, insisting that it has not happened by chance. This kind of religious interpretation permeates many of the annals and chronicles. For example, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle consistently refers to the Vikings as the heathens. One striking account comes from a monk at Saint-Germain, who describes a Viking encounter with King Charles the Bold's Frankish army. The Vikings captured more than 100 men from one contingent and hanged them in full view of the other to mock the king, his generals, and all the Christians present. The monk notes that the Frankish army was well armed with helmets and shields and lances, while the Vikings were unequipped and mostly unarmed, and very few. This account reveals two important details. The Vikings were not only skilled in psychological warfare, but early in their raiding career, they were poorly armed compared to the professional Frankish soldiers. While their equipment would evolve over time, early Viking raiders were more amateurish. As the Viking Age progressed, their martial prowess became more developed. Their involvement in the service of Byzantine emperors, the heroic descriptions in skaldic poetry, and the retrieval of axes and swords from Viking graves, including the famous Ulfberht swords, reflect this evolution. These high-quality weapons, often found preserved in rivers or soil, give the impression of a people defined by violence. However, this impression is also a product of the types of materials that survive. Wooden tools for peaceful activities, unlike metal weapons, tend to decompose and disappear from the historical record. Consequently, the archaeological and written sources emphasize the Vikings' martial nature, reinforcing their reputation as violent invaders. Contemporary accounts often depicted the Vikings as the violent other, and later medieval historians continued to view them as a uniquely destructive force. Scandinavians themselves in the High Middle Ages embraced this image. They celebrated their Viking ancestors in sagas and poetry, which glorified martial skill and painted colorful and often exaggerated pictures of Viking brutality, such as the infamous Blood Eagle ritual. The poet Sigvard Thordarson, for instance, commemorated the supposed execution of King Ella by Ivar the Boneless in his poem Knutsdråpa, describing how Ivar caused the eagle to cut Ella's back. While these images are graphic, they also reflect the nature of Viking Age poetry, which celebrated heroism through elaborate metaphors about battle and death. Most likely, the blood eagle is just the bird preying on corpses. The figure of the berserker warrior supposedly able to enter a trance-like fury in battle also seems rooted in mythology, though it may preserve some vague memories of ancient mystical brotherhoods. Despite these stories, the Vikings were pragmatic. They often preferred extortion to outright destruction. They collected tons of danegeld, a form of ransom or tribute, which chieftains used to gain followers and maintain power. While the Vikings were indeed violent, they were also profoundly opportunistic, employing a combination of hit-and-run tactics, plundering, blackmail, trading, and enslaving. As time went on, they increasingly sought to settle in the lands they raided, taking advantage of the political instability and gradually integrated into the societies they once terrorized. Now, one reason for the expansion of these raids was to export some of the violence at home, because we are dealing with an age of petty chieftains and kings seeking to consolidate their power. There has been recently a fascinating study about violence in the Viking Age in Scandinavia, attempting to investigate regional variation in employing violence, and the findings are really fascinating. The article titled Violence as a Lens to Viking Societies, a comparison of Norway and Denmark, investigates the nature and prevalence of violence in Viking Age societies, using it as a tool to analyze social structures, particularly in Norway and Denmark. The authors use violence as a lens to explore internal social structures within Norway and Denmark during the Viking Age, drawing on sociology, archaeology, osteology, and philology. The primary hypothesis is that as political authority becomes more centralized, violence is contained, and societies generally become more civilized. This means that the steeper the social hierarchy or pyramid, the lower the levels of interpersonal violence. The study begins by placing the Viking Age in its cultural and mythological context, with Norse mythology given here as example as being filled with violent imagery, starting with the world's creation from the body of the giant Ymir, slain by Odin and his brothers, and ending in Ragnarok, the apocalyptic final battle. The glorification of warriors, violent death, with the most honorable form of dying being in battle, leading to the afterlife in Valhall, reflected how deeply ingrained violence was in Viking Age culture. The mythology of Norse gods such as Thor and Odin, warrior deities also permeated the Viking mind, and a lot of poetry celebrated bloody battles, as previously stated. While the Vikings were known for their violent raids abroad, the study, however, emphasizes that internal violence within Scandinavian societies was also very significant, but less studied. The researchers compared violence in Viking Age Denmark and Norway using several indicators, analyzing skeletal trauma, the prevalence of weapons in graves, monumental constructions such as earthworks, and runestones. These serve as proxies for understanding how violence and social hierarchy were expressed differently in these regions. The study examines skeletal remains for evidence of weapon-inflicted injuries, higher rates of trauma interpreted as signs of higher levels of violence in society. The presence of weapons in graves, particularly swords, is analyzed as a reflection of the culture's readiness to engage in violence. Large-scale constructions such as fortifications and burial mounds are seen as indicators of centralized authority capable of mobilizing labor. And runestones, often commemorating the dead, serve as records of social stratification, with more elaborate runestones indicating greater social complexity and hierarchy. So what are the results? In terms of skeletal evidence, the study's osteological analysis reveals stark differences between Norway and Denmark in terms of interpersonal violence. In Norway, violence seems to have been widespread, with 60% of the analyzed skeletons from the Norwegian samples showing signs of weapon-related trauma, and 37% of individuals were determined to have died from violent causes. Men were more frequently affected, though women were not immune to violence. Notable injuries included sharp force trauma from bladed weapons such as sword and axes, as well as blunt force trauma from tools like hammers or clubs. Some evidence of penetrating injuries from spears and arrows was also found. A significant portion of the violence in Norway appeared to stem from interpersonal conflicts, possibly related to feuds or raiding activity. The violence was decentralized, with slayings occurring across both central and peripheral regions. In Denmark, violence was less common. Only 7% of the skeletons displayed evidence of trauma, and most violent deaths were official executions. Denmark's centralized political structure allowed for more controlled and regulated violence, with executions being a common method of enforcing authority. Compared to Norway, fewer individuals were found with evidence of violent conflict, reflecting a more pacified and controlled internal society. In terms of weapons, the presence of weapons in graves is another key indicator. In Norway, Viking Age graves frequently contained weapons. In many regions, particularly the agricultural lands of Rogaland and Trøndelag, swords were found in between 30 and 50% of male graves. The presence of weapons is seen as an indicator of the readiness for violence, and those buried with weapons often showed signs of violent deaths. Over 3,000 swords from the late Iron Age, so that would be roughly between the 6th and 11th century, have been discovered in Norwegian graves, a significant indicator of a society where martial prowess was highly valued. In contrast, Danish graves contained fewer weapons. Weapons were more commonly found in the graves of a wealthy warrior elite. The lower frequency of weapons, along with the greater social stratification, points to a society where violence was more concentrated among the elite and less common among the general population. About 85 swords were found across the Viking Age grave sample in Denmark. With regard to social structure and centralization, the study finds that Denmark had a much steeper social hierarchy than Norway. This is evidenced by the presence of monumental constructions such as the Scandinavia fortifications, which reflect the ability of the elite to command large-scale labor. Danish runestones indicate a society with well-defined social roles and ranks, often associated with centralized authority and aristocracy. So generally speaking, this region had a more developed political infrastructure, which reduced the need for interpersonal violence. Executions were an official method of containing violence, as opposed to Norway's more dispersed feud-based conflicts. The study also explores the role of gender. Women in both Denmark and Norway were subject to violence, though men were more frequently involved in violent acts. However, Denmark, with its more civilized environment and centralized authority, appears to have offered a greater protection to women, as societies with higher women's status tend to have lower levels of violence. However, that is a little bit relative. The comparative study supports the primary supposition As political authority becomes more centralized, violence decreases. So Denmark, with its steeper social pyramid and centralized authority, organized political system, had lower levels of interpersonal violence. The findings align with broader sociological theories from scholars who argue that state formation is associated with a reduction of violence as political authority takes on the role of regulating force. The study concludes that while both territories shared a Viking heritage, their internal social structures and relations with violence were different, highlighting the diversity within Viking Age Scandinavian societies. This research not only enhances our understanding of Viking Age societies, but also contributes to a broader discussion on the role of state formation. So the question about how violent the Vikings were, as well as many other questions about the Nordic Iron Age and Middle Ages, doesn't really offer a simple answer, but it challenges us to look much deeper than the usual simplified and stereotypical surface. And speaking of the Danish Viking Age, I also made the video about the wonderful, fascinating circular fortresses in Denmark from the time of Harald Bluetooth. If you have the curiosity, continue with this video. I'm sure you're going to find out many interesting things. Otherwise, thank you so much for listening. This was Irina, and if you did enjoy the topic, consider subscribing to the channel for much more Viking culture and history. And if you have a particular curiosity about this age, please do write in a comment as a potential topic for future videos. Thanks a lot, and till next time.